Welcome to the Sirius report. This is Paul, and I'm very thrilled today to welcome David Lee. I'm sure there's many of you who know who he is on the X platform. I've followed David for a long time. I really appreciate his perspectives on a whole bunch of things. And I thought it'd be really interesting, not least for me, but also for everyone listening, to get his thoughts on a variety of subjects. So, David, welcome and thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Paul, for inviting me. It's great to share my experience with some of your audience, and it will be an interesting discussion.
Yes, well, yes, absolutely, and we really appreciate it too. So, maybe just initially give people a little bit of background as to who you are and what you've done.
Yeah. So I was an engineer by training. I worked in the automotive sector in the States for a number of years. And after that, I went to business school and eventually turned into management consultant. So I worked in the States first, and then they shipped me over to Asia. So I was helping them to build up their presence in Hong Kong, China, and then have worked in a number of cities in China, covering mostly international clients and Chinese clients. So given my engineering background, I work a lot on the supply chain, help move manufacturing from Asia to US, from US to Asia to Europe, and then also within Asia, from China to India and Vietnam, from other places. So as a result, I have actually quite a lot of experience in the supply chain area. Personally, probably visited over 1,000 manufacturing plants of various sorts. And by the time I retired a few years back, I was leading leading the industrial sector group for a management consulting firm, covering anything from processing, mining, metals, to the downstreams in manufacturing, in automotive, and in industrial machineries. So a wide range of experience. I've seen a lot of things going on. And after retirement, I decided to move back to the States, and is actually focusing raising my kids in the States.
Well, thank you, David, and I really appreciate you providing people with that background because I think it'll really emphasize to people the discussion we're going to have now is something you've lived and breathed. You've, as I've said, you've walked the walk and talked the talk, and there's not a lot of people who have that broad experience and internationally, where you've dealt with Europe, you've dealt with the United States, Southeast Asia, and India, etc. So, what we thought to start with, and I know this is a huge subject, so we'll have to pick through it bit by bit, but this relates to the whole issue of supply chains, manufacturing competitiveness, and this is vis-a-vis between, say, the United States and China, or the United States and global South countries, and how this kind of factors into the whole tariff issue and sanctions, and I guess the US's capability to reshore and what the broader implications are ongoing for the US economy. So it's a huge subject. So I guess just dive in wherever you see fit.
Yep. I think there's a lot of misconception about why companies move manufacturing overseas. A lot of people on X basically say it is corporate greed. To some extent, yes. But if you take a look at the environment right now, a lot of people are saying that, oh, they're moving to China because it's cheap labor, is a sweatshop over there. In reality, in China, what we saw is it is no longer labor cost competitive as of like 2007, 2008 timeframe, almost 20 years ago. And you do see a lot of companies move things around from China to Vietnam to India to look for lowest cost possible. And what they found is, while the labor in China is not just good cost, but they also have good productivity. And a lot of companies actually moved back from Vietnam back to China. And we do see that this kind of reallocations of manufacturing all over Asia all the time. At the end of the day, the reason why China or Asia is a manufacturing hub right now for the rest of the world is because it has the entire supply chain over there. So think about Apple's. If you want to build an Apple iPhone, you need to have the PCB board, you need to have all the chips, you need to have the chip put into the PCB board, you need to have the microphones, you need to have the amplifier, you need to have the speaker, all these things. You can't do it in US because they don't have all the suppliers located in US. If you're located in China as an assembly plant, like they have right now in Foxconn, they basically buy all the stuff from nearby suppliers. And as a result, your turnaround time will be very, very quick, number one. Number two is if there's any problem, they can fix the problem with no problem, with very short lead time. If you have to ship a part from Asia to US, and then they figure out there's a problem, they need to rectify the problem at the source in China. And that would take a long, long time because you have the transportation involved in that. And as a result, you have a lot of bad inventory. And so I think even Tim Cook mentioned at one time that the reason they're actually doing manufacturing over in Asia, is not because of cost only. It's because the whole turnaround time, the whole supply chain is out there. And of course, at the end of the day, it's all about cost because it's the whole manufacturing cost or cost of goods sold is lower because the ecosystem is over there. But if you look at manufacturing, there are multiple sectors that are very different. If you look into the Walmart kind of manufacturing, so they go out, have a spec, and they buy something from a contract manufacturers over there. Technically, every year or every season, they will have a new requirements, and they can easily move from one supply to another supply. The question for them is whether the new supply has that capacity. And what we have found in the past is in China, you have a lot of this kind of SME suppliers who can make small volume. Well, small volume is like is relative. For Walmart, everything is the large volume, but they have one SKU have low volume, and their response time is very, very good. And they know what Walmart wants, and they know how to deal with Walmart. If you move to a new supplier, a lot of times you need to have a time of adjustment for Walmart or the suppliers in order to work smoothly with them. So the question for Walmart is whether they would be willing to move all the manufacturing from one location to another locations and risk, for example, during Thanksgiving time, they run into a problem with shipment, and then they will have empty shelves over there. And that is, for a lot of the retailers, they have to really handle this and have to deal with that. So whenever they need to migrate manufacturing from, for example, from China to Vietnam, they need to go phase by phase. You can't basically move 30% dramatically to Vietnam right away. This is the easiest type of manufacturing because Walmart or the retailer does not really hold any of the toolings and everything. And they, as long as they find someone who can make a similar products that technically fit the functional spec, the consumers at Walmart will be okay to buy it as long as it's a good price point. The more difficult one is when you go into industrial sector. When you talk about automotive, of course, a lot of the motors, a lot of the different parts are basically built in places where there's a huge automotive industry. And where are those places? Well, in Southeast Asia, in India, and in China. And China is by far the most advanced because of the largest, well, actually, China automotive market is actually the largest in the world. And so if you really want to switch supplies from China to another locations, it's much more difficult because the supplies in other places might not have the know-how, definitely not have the capacity to deal with it. And usually automotive has a much longer preparation time. You basically go through the design phase and validation phase early on before the car is launched. Once the car is launched, you usually don't want to change supply base because after 1 or 2 years, the parts will phase out, and the suppliers will still need to make the aftermarket products in order to fit the OEM. And so if you want to have a new program, the question is whether we want to develop a new supplies elsewhere and move all the volume over there. And hopefully the suppliers will be able to deal with it and can deliver on time and provide all the parts on time so that the OEM can launch the vehicles. And this is a huge risk, especially with quality assurance involved and everything. And so it takes a long time for you to develop a supply base, especially in automotive. I still remember the days when China was making less than 1 million vehicles back in, I think, the 1990s, late 1990s. And now they're making about 30 million vehicles. And throughout this time, the suppliers basically developed the capacity and also the capabilities in order to support the OEM market. Another thing I want to also mention is a lot of the engineering products that US or Europe design are not necessarily that manufacturable. The ease of manufacturing is also a key. A lot of adaptation at the plant level need to work with the design engineers in Europe and in US. And this is one area that China shines. Their engineers are very, very capable. Turnaround time is very quick. They work with the design engineers, was able to handle a lot of design change and make it adjustable so that it can be adapted to the manufacturing line. So there's a lot of things involved in all these issues. It's not as easy as people would think that, oh, I can just shut down China and move all their volumes overseas, over to Mexico, over back to US. It is, to some extent, a wishful thinking. And we don't have the kind of personnel or talent to actually handle all these kind of moves. Moving a line is a major, major issue. So this is just in a nutshell on how I see the whole supply chain issues that we are facing right now.
Yeah, that's a hugely important point, and it is lost on a lot of people. And I think partly was because the Americans gave the impression, well, we can sort of steal large sections of the Chinese market by, like you say, it's almost like a light switch. Oh, I'll just move operations to Vietnam and I'll open up a premises and we'll be running in a week or two, and then they can buy all the same parts or buy all the same components or all the same finished products, whatever that might be in the automotive sector or anything else. And it's as easy as that. And what's the problem? And we said all along, it's impossible. You can't do it quickly. And even if you can do it, then you've also got all the other factors that you've just laid out, which means it makes it extremely difficult for the United States to imagine that it can somehow create alternative markets somewhere to try and economically damage China. And I know one thing I discussed on my own podcast recently was developments with respect to India trying to reshore or trying to take manufacturing away from China. And they basically have now given up and realized we can't do it. It's not possible. So, for all the reasons you've highlighted. So I think it's extremely important for people to understand why China legitimately has this manufacturing supply chain competitiveness compared to large parts of the rest of the world. And it increasingly is able to adapt very rapidly to the necessary changes. And China's economy is rotating, it's changing, and they're adapting in real time to those challenges, and taking on board new technologies and becoming extremely competitive and market leaders in that regard. So, yeah, I think it's a really important point, and it's often lost on people because they think everything in the world is just flipping a light switch. And, it's like if I need resources, I can just go to this imaginary supermarket somewhere and buy them, and away we go. And of course, that's, not reality either. So I think that sort of feeds into another aspect of US policy. I mean, so what's your kind of feeling on US tariffs and the sanctions? Because they have sanctioned China as well, we know. Excuse me, all the issues with Huawei is one example. And of course, that failed. So, what's your feeling on the whole sort of tariff war and what's unfolding?
That is a big question that I have
Yes.
myself also. Why would you want to throw around 25% tariff on everyone at the same time? That is including Canada and Mexico. It is something very, very interesting. I think I've talked a lot on X with different people who always think that, oh, tariff is great. We can do the reshoring. Take a look at Hyundai. It's going to put like 2 billion or 20 billion in US. Apple is building plants, and TSMC is coming over. So we must have a renaissance of manufacturing. But one thing that I always ask people is, number one, do we have enough electricity to power all these plants? The question is very, very, very big. We haven't really increased our power electricity generation capacity too much. And of course, I talked to others who said that we are not using all our capacity yet. So of course, we can build a coal power plant within 3 years. Okay, you can build one coal power plant in 3 years. We probably need 100 of those. We're talking about quite a substantial expansion of our capacity. And even 100 additional coal power plant might not be enough. And once you have the coal power plant, you also need to have our power grid upgraded. And our power grid, some of them are as old as Thomas Edison. So it's ancient. So the problem we have is we just don't have the infrastructure to absorb all the new investment coming in. And having TSMC going to Arizona is another textbook case of why. I mean, TSMC built foundry for semiconductor, and what you need is electricity. You also need a lot of power, and you choose to go to a desert area to build a foundry is very, very questionable. And so there's a lot of issues with regard to that. Other than that, you also have talent issues. In the US, we have been incentivizing people to go to law school, business school, instead of engineering schools. And if you go to engineering school, I just recently went to an engineering school commencement ceremony, and half of the students were Asians. And of course, I don't know if they are Asian Americans or if they are foreign students. A lot of them might look like, when they hear them talking, they have very heavy accents, so they might be foreign students. And so if we can't really produce engineers and scientists that are locally developed and they will stay locally, it will be very, very challenging for us to handle the new renaissance of manufacturing. And of course, there's a lot of discussion right now with H-1B visa, whether we should be tightening it down so that we don't give out all the jobs to foreign students. That will also limit our supply of talent going into manufacturing. But manufacturing is not only just for engineering degree people or professionals. We also have to have the maintenance guy, the technicians, and the machine shop owner. For those who are not into manufacturing, you might not know, for all the parts that are manufactured, you usually have machine shops to basically make the tools for those. You cannot just buy everything from Rangers or buy from Master. You have to have an engineer tools in order to put into the assembly line or the manufacturing line in order to build the products that you need. We just don't have enough technicians that are machine shop machinists that can do all the jobs. Even in welding, how many welders can we actually have? So all these things is the entire support system is not there. And if you have an influx of factories coming into US and demand talent, what you would see, number one, is the wage rate will go up dramatically, maybe 30-40% easily. And that would make domestically made products even less competitive than before, even with 25% of tariffs. So I think there's a lot of things that we need to think through. And of course, people will say that, hey, we don't need to do everything at the same time. We need to prioritize the high value products we make here. We still import other stuff. But if we still import other stuff, what happened to the 25% tariffs? So everything is more expensive and inflation rate will be going out of control. And so there's a lot of questions about the current policy that we have. Another misconception is, well, if we do this, we will we do the 20-some% tariffs on China, we will hurt China. The thing is, right now, I think in the first term of Trump, we already have on average about 14% tariffs on Chinese goods. And in the latest 20 additional percent, we are talking about 34% tariffs on Chinese goods. Worst come to worst, China would not ship anything to US. And who would hurt the most is probably not China, because China has been diversifying their export destinations for the last 12 years, since Xi Jinping came to power in 2013. There was the whole idea why they have the One Belt, One Road system, and now it's called the BRI initiative. And in 2013, he initiated that. 2015, he initiated the Made in China 2025. And right now it's 2025. And pretty much most categories that they aim to achieve has been achieved, except one areas in the chip manufacturing areas. And they still need to import the ASML, EUV to build up their own capabilities. But as we speak right now, the DUV machines is already being mass produced, and they are actually testing out the EUV machines. And so might be coming out in 2026 or 2027. And by that time, our whole chip war with them will be completely at a loss. But at the same time, China do have a lot of things that US needs. If you look into the pharmaceutical area, a lot of the antibiotics and the ingredients going into the drugs are actually coming from China. And so if you don't want to buy anything from China, you might not get your vitamin C, you will not get your Tylenol because the ingredients are made from there. You most likely won't get your penicillin. And so who would actually have the most problems? And I think in the US, the consumer will be paying the highest price for that. And so this is something that we need to really understand why China is actually acting what it is now. I think the problem with the Trump administration is they might not be very familiar with how to deal with Chinese. When he imposed 25% on Canada and Mexico, what did they do? They immediately called Trump and try to get a deal out of it. When they do 10% to China, China basically didn't do anything except retaliation. Because when you negotiate in the Chinese culture, you need to negotiate in a good faith. And you can't basically just have a big steak and no carrot and come into a negotiating table expecting the other side to concede. That would happen if you're very, very weak. If China was very, very weak, like in the 19th century, but China right now believe that it is much stronger and it is an equal footing with the US, and there's no way that they will concede. And so as a result, after the 10%, China retaliate. After another 10%, China retaliate. And the Trump, I will have a call with Xi Jinping within 24 hours, basically delay for 2 months. Nothing happened. And so we'll have to see what will happen. I think recently during the Global Development Forum, one of the allies of Trump was actually in China, talking to the Chinese. So what I've heard so far is it was not really going too well. And so we'll have to see how it eventually will turn up. And maybe Trump will need to pick up the phone and call China and see whether there will be any room for negotiation.
Yeah, it's a huge problem. I know from my experience in China and in business dealings, you're absolutely right. It has to be in good faith. And if you develop a solid, trusting relationship, then the Chinese can be very accommodating. And I had experience of that. And if you had a legitimate issue and you discussed it on that basis, they were very receptive to it. But you're absolutely right. If you go in with the all guns blazing, so to speak, then you will get short shrift from the Chinese, and rightly so. They won't tolerate that kind of behavior. But I think you've made a lot of extremely important points about the problems the United States faces reshoring and why currently it's extremely difficult and in some senses impossible. And the other thing, of course, is the United States is clearly panicking with regards to accessibility to resources, hence all the noises about Greenland and about Ukraine, and trying to secure deals to try and get hold of resources they're going to need in the future. And now they're trying to talk about starting up exploration in the US itself, which is, people think it's just a question of drilling holes in the ground and there's the resource. And of course, that's equally nonsensical. And that's another huge problem that exists. I think that might lead into an interesting question, which is, we've seen recent moves, well, not recent, but an acceleration of recent moves by the Chinese to do with strategic reserves. And maybe it'd be a good question to ask is how that relates to the broader challenges as well the US is going to face with regards to having access to the resources it needs, assuming, of course, reshoring's even a possibility, which at the moment it clearly isn't. But what's your feeling about the whole sort of the issue of strategic reserves? And obviously, we've already seen issues between the Chinese and the Americans with respect to, exporting, for example, things like gallium and germanium, etc.
I think the historical European model is you conquer. Well, you can say that it's more imperialism model. Is you basically conquer a colony, and then you basically squeeze whatever that can come out of the colony. For example, cobalt from Congo, or iron ore from Brazil and different places, in order to first of all, push the price down so that you can actually ship the products back to home country, and then you put value add to that, and then you sell it at a much higher price, and you basically keep the profit margins. That's a historical model. With the emergence of the Global South, a lot of the Global South residents are saying that, hey, maybe it's our own resource, it is our own business, it's none of your business. So France no longer get cheap uranium from Africa, and they now have to pay much higher price for uranium. And the same thing for China. China historically has been the supply base for a lot of the rare earth. And even Deng Xiaoping talked about rare earth will be one weapons that they have. But let's take a look at rare earth. Rare earth itself is not rare. Rare earth is, you can find it all over the world. The cost to mine the rare earth is one consideration. So you need to have high concentration of rare earth in order to have a good grade so that you can actually mine. And China happens to have a lot of those deposits in there. The other issue is once you have the rare earth mine, you need to process it and purify it. And because no one was in the rare earth business for so many years, China basically developed the entire process by themselves. And now they have actually hold the patent for most of these processing technology. And so as a result, even you can have Australian companies mining rare earth, US company mining rare earth. What they did was they sent the rare earth over to China, asked them to process and ship it back. And China in 2022, in retaliation for the chip war, decided that let's step up and protect our own resource. So rare earth will not be shipping overseas or under sort of like export control, or you need to get permits in order to ship it out. And things you mentioned about gallium and germanium. And of course, gallium and germanium is not technically rare earth, but is another area, is metals that are not in the rare earth, but at the same time, they are not usually easily obtainable. And germanium is very interesting. Gallium is very interesting. A lot of people say that, hey, I have gallium mine, I can actually mine it myself. The problem is gallium usually is a byproduct of aluminum. And usually you get about 50 grams or less of gallium from 1 ton of aluminum processing. And I think China has about 400 some million tons of aluminum productions a year, and US has less than 1 million. And so that was one reason why Trump wants to push the aluminum and steel import tariff so that you can bring back the steel production and aluminum production. Again, there's another problem. Is aluminum productions or smelting basically needs a lot of energy, whether you have energy. One reason why in Canada we can actually have a lot of aluminum production is because they have cheap energy. US doesn't have that. The gallium is actually very interesting because it is used in a lot of the defense projects, especially in radar. If you can actually have gallium in your radar system, you can actually see a lot farther because I think it can prevent the whole system from overheating. So right now, China is actually using gallium to basically develop radar for their early warning system plane. And US also have that technology, but not have gallium. And it doesn't have the reserve. And so the problem right now is if you take a look at the F-35 production numbers, you do see that there's a significant drop of F-35 productions over the last couple of years. No one can explain it because there are so many orders right now to order this F-35 before the current wave of Canada and Germany may be cutting up the F-35 program. But you still have a lot of back order. And what we do see is Lockheed Martin was not able to deliver. One of the questions people are asking is that because they can't get the gallium radar onto the system? And that was the reason why they have this kind of problems. But what we do see is more and more countries with resources will be thinking about this directions, whether they should sell their resource very cheap or whether they should actually protect the resource. And you can talk about maybe Mexico protecting the silver, maybe South Africa protecting is gold and diamond, there are a lot of questions about that. At the same time, when you talk about China is mentioning about strategic reserve, China always have strategic reserve on a number of items, but they have a huge publicity over the last few months, I think, talking about increasing strategic reserve in copper, petroleum, and a number of metals. For example, I think nickel is in one of those. And one of the reasons people are saying that they might have that reason is they are preparing for war. But I think it's less so preparing for war, but more so is they have a lot of excess US dollar. They have been buying gold, but they are not able to use up all the excessive US dollar. So what can they do? They just buy everything that is available around the world. Mineral is something that you can store all the time. You can't buy grain and store for 10 years, but you can buy metal store for a century. And so this is maybe one reason that they decided to do this. And this leads to a story that I want to share. It's back in 2008, 2009 timeframe. During the GFC, I was actually in Beijing at the time, and a lot of people in Beijing were already talking about, hey, US dollar is not very reliable. And definitely US Treasury is not reliable. Can we just keep on buying US Treasury? And at the time, a lot of the bureaucrats is very pro-Western, and they decided to keep on buying. So that's basically helped US to come out of the GFC problems. But the soul was already seated. There was always a lot of discussion whether we should diversify, going into other areas. And one thing that actually happened, I think, is in around 2009, 2010 timeframe, is China suddenly asked all the state-owned enterprise to think about going overseas and doing M&A, what we call the outbound M&A from China. And the reason is that is one avenue they can use up the excess US dollar that they had at the time so that they don't have to buy US dollar. So you do see a lot of merger and acquisition at around 2010 to 2013 timeframe. Chinese companies go overseas and buy up a lot of companies and also buying buildings and so forth, infrastructure. But they also find out there's a problem, because if the company is very good with a lot of technology, they usually don't want to sell it to the Chinese. If they're bad, there's really no point for the Chinese to buy. So that sort of dies down. And eventually Chinese are thinking about, well, how we can actually diversify. In 2013, the Belt and Road Initiative was one initiative that now becomes a very, very big topic for Chinese. And why did they do that? A lot of discussion at that time was, China want to use up excess capacity of steel and cement in China so that they can actually help the third world to build the infrastructure. That to some extent is true, but in hindsight, 12 years later, you do see that because of Belt and Road Initiative, they were able to diversify their export from US, European-centric to Belt and Road Initiative-centric. And right now, ASEAN and Belt and Road basically account for the largest part, the majority of Chinese export. And so this whole direction of shifting is not something that just happened overnight. It has been planned ever since Xi was in the position, or maybe even before Xi was in the position. It is just a long-term strategy that a lot of people would say that in hindsight, you do admire how far they think ahead. The Chinese think maybe decades ahead and basically put their pieces on the chessboard, while the Americans think about what happened in the next election, which is within 2 years. And so it is a very, very different mentality when you actually try to think about what the Chinese are planning. If you look at it from a US and European standpoint, it's very hard to understand.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, for me, it's very easy to understand, but I have the benefit of spending quite a bit of time in China and working in China and working with Chinese companies. And it's interesting what you said about late 2008 and the feeling in China, because I was there kind of early 2009. And I saw that that was very clear as well with regards to the whole issue of US treasuries and thinking about the future. And you could see there was definitely in some quarters a bit of a shift in attitude happening then. And now here we are in 2025, and it's self-evident what those big shifts are. And I think it's extremely interesting for you to relate the strategy China deploys, because for me, it's quite difficult. I've said to people for a long time, I think once you understand China, it's quite, for me now, relatively a lot easier to understand what they're saying and what they mean by what they're saying. And it's great that you're able to impart all your knowledge and wisdom and understanding of these subjects as well, to kind of just reinforces that perspective, because it is difficult, as you said at the end of what you were just saying, for people in Western countries to understand the Chinese mentality, what China's thinking, China's long-term plans, which they do stick to. And by and large, they're very successful in doing those. And I think another point that I would like to get your perspective on, because you mentioned this obviously on X, and you talked about, you drew parallels to the US and Russia and a kind of arms race back in the Cold War days, but you sort of drew it to the parallel of where we are today and China's perspective with respect to the US and what amounts to another kind of arms race. And I'd like for you to share your thoughts with the listeners as to what you feel is going on in that regard, because I think it's highly interesting, extremely relevant, and frankly, I haven't seen it. Well, I don't know what everyone's thinking or talking about, but I haven't seen anyone else mention this. And I think it's really important and interesting for you to share your views on that.
Yeah, I think I've heard a lot of people talk about the art of war from Sun Tzu, but Art of War is only one of the many military books that are out there from the Chinese history. The crux of Chinese military is to use military only as the last resort. You don't want to use it easily, but you want to basically work with your opponents like playing chess, and you set up things so that they fall into an area that they can't really do much damage to you. And if you look at all the policies that China has been doing over the last couple of decades, is number one is to avoid confrontation. But they, at the same time, they build up their military capabilities so that even if there's a confrontation, they can protect themselves. We see a lot of Chinese military news lately. They are basically focusing on, but they're going into a blue ocean navy that can go much longer than they used to. They can circle Australia and so forth. But the majority of their armaments is actually focusing on defending the homeland. But China historically is very shy about talking about all these things, because the late leader, Deng Xiaoping, actually have a directives to the leaderships that they have to do a few things. And everybody talk about, the hide your glory kind of things is the model that Chinese leadership is taking. Is actually a lot deeper. The original directives from Deng Xiaoping was observe calmly, steady your position, deal with it calmly, hide your glory, be good at hiding weaknesses, and never take the lead. And so if you take a look at Jiang Zemin and also take a look at Hu Jintao, they are very much to this directives. They hide their glory. They don't do anything that to confront their adversaries, and they try to keep the world very calmly. But very interesting, in last December, after Trump won the election, in Boxing Day, December 26th, Chengdu Aircraft Industry Group basically unveiled the sixth generation plane. At the same day, Shenyang Aircraft Corporations also unveiled its own sixth generation plane. One is called J-36, one is now called J-50. On that same day, the 076 amphibious assault drone carrier was launched. And a lot of people are talking about, oh, this drone carrier is amphibious assault craft is for attacking Taiwan. It is well, it can do that, but it's not just for that. It is a 40,000 tons aircraft carrier that's specifically designed for drones. And so what is 40,000 tons? 40,000 tons is is equivalent to the French aircraft carrier Charles de Gaulle. And so it's a small size aircraft carrier, but if it's just for drones, it's more than enough. And so on 27th, they unveiled the KJ-3000 Airborne Early Warning and Control, or the AWACS system. So a lot of these news came out a month after Trump was elected. And then subsequently, there's a lot of additional news. And the question at the time was, why would China do this? And a lot of commentators would say, oh, China wants to make sure Trump and his administration will not miscalculate and know that China has that capabilities so that they don't push China too much. But knowing the Chinese culture is China deal with different people differently. Trump seems to be a very spontaneous and with a very responsive or aggressive, to some extent, aggressive personality. He always wants to be number one. He never wants to be number two. So if you say all these things in front of him, the first reaction is we need to do better because USA is number one. We are number one. And so that's why I really think that it may be a lure or a trap. I don't know if those aircraft really works, but by doing it, Trump has to basically reactivate what we call now F-47 program. It is not something that is just come out right out of the air. I mean, they have been testing it for a few years. And then Biden decided that it's too expensive. He will let the new president to decide. And Trump basically right now put $20 billion into Boeing to develop this. The interesting thing is, why is Boeing? I mean, Boeing has not really been what we would call the very, very capable engineering companies lately. The spaceship was leaking, the plane was crashing all the time, and it hasn't really delivered a fighter in the past history. It has, to some extent, through McDonnell Douglas, which they acquired. But Boeing has not really have a good track record in contracting fighting of fighters with the U.S. Air Force. So that was one thing that I actually mentioned in one of the posts. And if you take a look at what happened in the Soviet Union versus what happened in the US right now, the resemblance is very, very striking. I still remember Reagan was talking about using the Star Wars system and we'll protect ourselves. Now we call it the Golden Dome. But at that time, it's the Star Wars system 40 years later, the Star Wars system is still not working. Of course, it was just a stunt to bait USSR to basically throw in a lot of money into the arms race. And as a result of that, Soviet Union was not able to focus on the economic development, and its economy basically tanked. Another thing is US actually pushing the oil price to a very, very low price during the entire 80s. And as a result, one major revenue of USSR was basically cut off. And if you take a look at right now, what China have been doing is US is very, very lucrative in terms of EV in the past. Tesla was the only one. And China EV basically destroyed the whole market in terms of margins. US was very, very good at looking at the AI and basically saying that AI, you basically need to throw in a lot of money into chips, NVIDIA chips. And as a result, you will be able to have huge profit, and that will lead you to the new industry. And China basically used DeepSeek to destroy the whole myth about you need to have a huge investment. And this not only affect the open AI, but it also affect dramatically on the chip formulations, whether we need to have huge investment into GPU, and NVIDIA basically took a hit on that. And at the same time, we mentioned China is actually developing EUV and DUV machines that actually would collapse the margin for ASML and also lower the price of chips in the future. So everything US is making a lot of money out of it suddenly becomes less likely to be a money printing machine. The Mac 7 basically all becomes a LAC 7. And this is something that China may be playing exactly what the USSR playbook was. And at the same time, another external environment USSR went through was Afghanistan. During the 70s and 80s, because of Afghanistan, they were sanctioned left and right. And it turned into a black hole for USSR, burning money and also the gear. US didn't really need anyone to help them. US basically did it by themselves in Iraq, and Afghanistan burned billions, actually trillions of dollars, and now in Ukraine, Gaza, and also Yemen. And as a result, we also see that the US is not, or actually not just US, the entire NATO is not actually capable of fighting a long duration war with manufacturing capabilities falling well behind the pace of the war. And last but not least, we also see that the US want to align with China back into the reopening with relationship with Mao Zedong in the 70s, and using the China-US alliance or partnerships to basically isolate Russia at the time, or Soviet Union at the time. And what we do see right now is China, Russia, Iran, and a number of other nations are actually forming into BRIC and also other alliances that work very diligently to bypass US. And the last one is very, very interesting, is because when USSR was weakened, it was not able to support its domestic economy. It also cannot support its allies. And as a result, the Warsaw Pact collapsed. And what we do see right now is Trump is doing exactly the same thing, because the US economy is not able to support itself. And what it does is actually cutting funding through US aid, and also cutting funding to all the NATO allies and asking them to fight for themselves. And the whole process is eerily similar to the 1980s Reagan playbook to create the downfall of USSR. So I found it very, very interesting And it may be something that we might want to study a little bit more to see if this is a genuine intention of the adversaries of US, or it is just a coincidence.
Yeah, but it's a very fascinating subject. And you're right. I think in the coming months and in the next year or two, I think that will unfold more and more, and we'll have a better understanding. I mean, I don't think it's a coincidence how the US has responded, whether China's intentions are, nefarious and inverted commas, to use a bit of a crude term, to suck the United States into an arms race it can't afford to finance. Well, we don't know exactly at this point in time if that's the case, but certainly the byproduct of what China's doing is precisely that, where they're trying to cut small amounts of money, as you said, through Doge, and then in the next breath they're opening the spigots and saying, well, we'll pay 20 billion towards the F-47, and 20 billion will rapidly become 200 billion, because that's how it works. And and it remains to be seen, to what extent that project ever comes properly to fruition. The F-35, I've said for years, has been fraught with huge problems, and they've spent $2 trillion. So, it could well be a Chinese tactic to get the United States sucked into something that it can't afford to really pay for ultimately, and it will cause some huge damage. I mean, yes, the United States is not the USSR, but the playbook is very similar. And it's interesting, there has been some commentators who've talked about the United States going through its own Soviet Union phase currently, and in many ways I would agree with that assessment, but people have to be very careful in understanding what that means. We're not saying the United States is the Soviet Union as it was then now, but it's going through those same processes. So what I thought we'll talk about gold and silver another time, because that's a big, long, huge subject, and I'd like to get your views on that. But I thought a final question I'd like to ask you is China's role in terms of AI, where it's been historically, what it's doing, and where you see China going, because DeepSeek was not a surprise to anyone who understands China. But again, we talk about coincidences. I don't believe the timing of that announcement was a coincidence in relation to this proposed US Stargate $500 billion project, which ever since then, I've not heard a word about it. But I'd like to get your thoughts on China's perspective and where you think it's going and being with respect to AI.
Well, I think this is one area that China has been talking about for a long time. I still remember the days when a lot of German companies came to China. I think it's 2012 or 2013 timeframe, talk about Industrial Revolution 4.0. And that's when we talk about robotics, we talk about the Internet of Things, how to connect everything to go into Industrial Revolution in a new phase. China in the Made in China 2025 basically also focus on creating capabilities in these areas. And one of the reasons is they see that it is a inevitable development of global industrial evolutions. So as a result, they really embrace that, and they learn a lot from the German counterparts coming to China to talk about it and promote it. At the same time, they also run into, they have their own issues in China. A lot of people talk about demographics. China is actually having aging populations, and eventually a few working people will need to support 4 or 5 elderly in their retirement to support them. And so the question is, how can a society function that way? And automations, robotics, and AI is one area that the government do see that can actually help facilitate this aging populations. So there's a lot of support into that. The interesting thing is, with regard to DeepSeek, is basically coming from a nobody heard of companies with very limited budget, sort of doing it as a side hobby with pretty much all local talent. And the way that they question the narrative of the West, that in order to do AI, you need to throw in a lot of GPUs to push your AI capacity to the maximum in order for AI to work. So this is one narrative that, for example, NVIDIA and ChatGPT has been pushing, is this is a rich people game. You poor guy cannot actually afford to do it, so we will do it first, and you can actually pay a fee and use our capabilities. I think this group of maybe revolutionaries are saying that, hey, maybe we have a better way to do it. So they figure out how to use mathematical models to cut corners so that they can actually use a limited resource to come up with the same outcomes or similar outcomes. And history has proved that their capabilities is actually on par or exceed the Western counterparts. And the amazing part about that is after January, I think they announced it on January 20th or 21st. No, January, maybe 26th or 27th. After that, the mobilization of the Chinese government to push companies or encourage companies to link up with them is just amazing. Nowadays, you go to buy anything in China, from automotive to refrigerator, they all have some kind of link to DeepSeek or to any other AI model. So we do see that that would be one area that will be explosive going forward. And at the same time, people talk about the robots in China, especially in the spring gala that they have on TV. The robots basically doing dances. That company, Unitree, is actually growing. It's just a startup, but it's very interesting that after, I think, 2020, they haven't really had another round of funding. That means that they said that they are actually growing out of their organic income. And so for a startup that doesn't really require keep on diluting the shares and keep on getting funding is pretty much unheard of. So we do see that the government is actually pushing a lot of support to these kind of companies, not financially, but actually helping them to link up with different industries so that they can actually have much better, much broader audience and faster learning of adaptation to the society. And nowadays, even in education system, they're actually doing a lot of AI programming, AI logics into their educations, so that students can get exposed very early on in their development stage, and eventually can actually make this something that you can breathe with. AI is something that is normal. It's not something that is very challenging for people to adapt to. So I think we're still very early stage on this development. We'll have to see whether this is the right approach. But I'm very optimistic that within 1 to 2 years, AI will be so embedded into daily life that things will be very different compared with what we saw maybe a few years back.
Yeah, I'd agree. I think it's a very interesting sort of new area of technology. And it's interesting when you talk about domestic robots, because I was talking to someone back in 2017, and I was over in China at the time, and I broached the subject regarding robots and their domestic use. And they said, and this tied in with this whole issue of the demographic issue and how, you take care and look after the elderly. And they said there was a feeling that, in relatively short periods of time, I mean, we're only talking 8 years ago, then that there would be a time when you would see a lot of houses having robots that would perform a lot of menial tasks, which would be able to support the elderly population of in China and other countries. And we're now, I mean, people will disagree with this and people don't like the idea of this, but that's not why we're discussing this. We're discussing why I feel that this is going to happen, and it will happen probably a lot sooner than people imagine. And that will, to a large extent, deal with quite a lot of the issues of an aging population and who looks after them and how that's going to work. Well, no, that will be controversial. It won't. A lot of people will get very upset by that and won't like it. But we're just saying, from a technological standpoint, there were discussions going on quite a long time ago, and they are now coming into fruition a lot quicker, perhaps, than people realize. And so whilst there is always demographic problems, I think, as ever, the Chinese have been looking at this for a very long time, and assessing how they were going to deal with this, because they knew there was going to be some decline in the population to some degree, but not as exaggerated as the West always likes to make out, because that's one of their key kind of talking points about China, is the demographic collapse. So I think that's probably a good point to stop, David. So thank you very much. It's been a wonderful chat. I've really enjoyed it, and getting all your insights and your perspectives, and imparting all your knowledge and wisdom for the listeners. So thank you very much. It's really appreciated.
Thank you, Paul.
And we look forward to obviously doing more in the future with you. So with that, I'll say goodbye and thank you to everyone who supports the channel. Please like, share, subscribe, comment, spread the word. We're trying to grow the channel because, as ever, and people are sick of me saying this, we like to keep people informed and not entertained. And with that, I'll say goodbye.